Hello and welcome to Jericho TV. I'm here with Natalie Bennett, the former leader of the Green Party, and we're going to discuss the relative success of the party over the last 10 years or so. So the first question I thought I'd start with is people are increasingly aware of environmental issues, and the Green Party polls quite well. But what I want to ask is, why is that not translated into electoral success?
Well, of course, the simple answer to that is that we have a deeply undemocratic system in Britain. In fact, we're not really a democracy at all. With the first past the post electoral system, in the last election, 68% of votes didn't count. If you go back to the election in 2015 when I was leader, we got 1.1 million votes. In most of the rest of Europe, most of the developed world, a proportional system that would have meant 25 MPs. But of course we have the first past the post system. We just got the one MP return, Caroline Lucas. So we have first past the post in the Commons. Then of course we have an unelected House of Lords, which is really in the 21st century quite laughable. So the reason why the Green Party doesn't have a bigger voice in Parliament is because Britain isn't a democracy.
Okay, so what sort of system would you advocate? I mean, there was an election, a referendum in 2010 that gave people the chance to vote for an alternative system, and that was quite roundly rejected.
The key word is, and you used the right word there, which was an alternative system, but it wasn't a proportional system. Okay. The hashtag is AV, is not PR. Alternative vote is the system used in the lower house in Australia, and it actually quite often returns less proportional results. The Australian Greens in the last general election there got 10% of the first preference votes and still got one seat. And indeed, there's just been a Queensland state election, same result, 10% of votes, one seat. So what was offered was a pretty hopeless system, and I stood on doorsteps and I was advocating for a change and saying, well, you should vote for this because it's a little bit better than what we've got now, even if it isn't very good. I wasn't very surprised we lost the election.
Okay, so playing devil's advocate, being a proportional system, for example, the one they've got in Germany at the moment, that tends to lead to stalemate, or in Austria, extremist parties entering the system. I mean, there's room for compromise in every system. So why would a proportional system be better despite those disadvantages?
Okay, well, I think three things to say about that. First, about votes like for the AfD in Germany. If you don't allow space for people's views to be expressed, views to be represented, even if you don't like those views, what you have is people who feel like they haven't been listened to. So I would say that the Brexit referendum result was one of the outcomes of first past the post. People felt like they hadn't been listened to for decades. They knew their vote would never count. And so they took that chance to just give the establishment a kicking and say, we want our vote to count. Now, I very much disagreed with the result, but I understand the motivations behind that. And secondly, in terms of forming coalitions, etc., well, what you have actually now in Britain is two unwieldy, unstable, very messy coalitions. They're called the Tory Party and the Labour Party. And if you look at, for example, views on Brexit, there's a total spread across the Tory Party, there's a total spread across the Labour Party. Even if you look at economic views or social issues, basically you have people forced together for reasons of convenience, and people feel like they don't know what the parties stand for, they don't trust them, parties say different things in different places. It's profoundly corrupting of our politics. Whereas if we had a PR system, a proportional system, maybe we'd have perhaps 6 or so significant parties. I mean, the Dutch actually have about 8 or 9 significant parties. Everyone can vote for politics that really reflects their views. They see it represented in Parliament. And also what you get, I would say that kind of governance you get from that is much better, because we have really a dictatorship in Britain. The Prime Minister, or in major departments, a single minister says, right, we're going to do this. There's no debate, there's no discussion, there's no attempt to arrive at a consensus policy that people can agree on. What you actually get is one person making a decision which might be the right direction, but perhaps the wrong details. And then we get policy that's implemented, and then another minister comes in or a government changes, and we get 180 degrees turn in the opposite direction.
I mean, that can happen, but isn't that the role of parliaments to check that? Theresa May recently suffered a reverse in Parliament.
But that's still very rare, because one of the problems is that the two-party system means is that people are very subject to the whip, which means people are forced to vote against their inclinations, their beliefs, by the party system. The Green Party doesn't whip. We think people should act on their conscience, their beliefs, what they've heard from their constituents, what they've said to their constituents. So we have a system really that's broken and produces a very poor quality of governance. Anyone who's watching this, if you want to read about this, there's a great book by a guy called Steinringen, Nation of Devils, and it really tears apart the British and American systems.
Okay. But that's the system we currently have. So if we talk about those up to unwieldy coalitions, you refer to the Labour and the Tory party, many Greens have accused them of stealing Green policies. Is that a cause to celebrate as a Green Party MP, or does that leave you?
Well, I would say, I have never used the word stealing. I'm in politics to get political change, and if we win a victory, that's great. And if you look to some of the victories we've run, 10 years ago, the Green Party started saying we need to have a real living wage. The unlikely figure of George Osborne conceded the principle, if not delivered the reality, by calling his new minimum wage the living wage. Now, it's actually not the real living wage, but nonetheless, the principle was conceded, even though 10 years ago when we first said that, people said, oh, no, that's crazy Greens, radical ideas. Another good example is 20 mile per hour speed limits, where people live, work and shop. 10 years ago, the Green Party saying this, radical Greens, crazy ideas. Now the City of London is 20 mile per hour speed limit. So what we've traditionally done in politics is introduced ideas that have been then adopted as people's own. In fact, I've just been in Oxford at the Real Farming Conference, and Michael Gove's been out today saying that we have to stop the rich landowners getting lots and lots of agricultural subsidies, which is exactly what the Green Party's been saying for decades. So, we're glad when we win the arguments, but the reality is of the state of the world now, economically, socially, politically, environmentally, we've got to move much faster. So we want to get into government, we want to run governments, because then we'll implement the policies without that 10-year gap.
So one of those supposedly radical policies that the Greens have for quite a while held is the idea of a minimum income.
Universal basic income, or citizens' income.
And you see that slowly being introduced in some countries in Europe in a very controlled manner. Do you think that's something we might see on a wider scale in 10, 20 years' time?
Very much so. I mean, I've recently been in Finland looking at where they're running a trial with people. It's not exactly universal basic income, it's people who've been on long-term benefits, but it's an interesting trial. Scotland's looking at doing it. Netherlands is doing it in some places. Canada's doing it in places. And again, even in 2015, when I said that and explained the Green Party policy in the general election, it was, radical, crazy ideas. But actually, the idea that nobody should be left penniless, nobody should be left without any money at all, as far as I'm concerned, most people would accept a human right that says no one should starve, no one should be left without a roof over their head. And yet we don't deliver the means of doing that these days, and so we have to do that. And also, it's a huge opportunity for people to spend their lives well, to use their lives genuinely productively. You want to start a small business with a universal basic income. You've got that foundation of security behind you. You want to become an artist, develop your craft, develop your art. It gives you the chance to use your life well.
And have you seen any evidence, for example, in Finland, of that being adopted further?
Well, I think what we've seen is most of these trials have actually started in the last year or so, so we're really in the initial phases of it. But there's a couple of interesting case studies I've seen. There was actually a trial done in Canada in the 1970s, and it's a classic example of right-wing neoliberal ideology. The trial was run, and then all the papers and results were locked up and only actually released and published a couple of years ago because the right-wing government took over, and that showed that people were using their life well. There's some interesting examples from the global south, where, if you give people, say, an income of like $2 a day, you can really turn around people's lives, turn around a whole village. And there's another interesting case study from the US, actually, of an Indian group that has revenues from a casino that actually gives people pretty well the equivalent of a universal basic income. And there the studies show that children get a better education, people are healthier. What we all need to live a decent life is security, and that's what universal basic income gives you.
And if we assume that the biggest opposition to this comes from the right-wing ideology, as you say, the left has always been traditionally quite divided. It's been one of its big drawbacks. And
I think if you look at the right, the right's pretty divided too. But
okay, but it tends to get elected more, at least in this country. Would the Greens ever come together as part of a broader left-wing coalition, as was mooted in the last election?
I think what we've always said is, we have a unique Green political philosophy, And that's very clear and distinct, and that's built on an understanding that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. Ultimately, that's not politics, it's physics, and that's where we start from. Now, there are others who share lots of views with us on things like wages. We certainly would work together with. But what we would always do is, rather than looking at the idea in our current system of a coalition, which means giving up a lot of your principles, we'd look towards a confidence and supply agreement. We would do everything we possibly could to ensure there wasn't a Tory government. But we'd also perhaps, not take the ministerial cars and therefore reserve the right to vote against Trident nuclear weapons, to vote against Hinkley C, to vote against HS2, third runway at Heathrow, etc. So what we need is a politics of principle, and that's what the Green Party stands for and is.
Okay, and you mentioned infinite growth is impossible and we have finite resources. Do you think the environmental debate is sometimes poorly framed? I saw this morning the Conservative MP for climate change, Secretary of State for climate change, was crowing about the fact this was the first year, 2017, that Britain had produced more non-fossil fuel electricity from fossil fuels. Is that the wrong way to frame the debate? That the fact we're still using electricity, is it not about lowering our consumption?
Well, I think, the great Cinderella of energy policy is energy conservation. The cleanest, greenest energy you can possibly have is the electricity or the energy you don't need to use. And one of the great disasters of recent years since 2010 is that we now have no government money going into home energy efficiency. And insulating people's homes, ensuring they're warm, comfortable, affordable to heat, cuts people's bills, it cuts carbon emissions, it improves health and well-being. It's just a no-brainer of a policy. And that focus on glitzy, shiny machines is certainly the wrong way to go. And also, one of the other things to say is, we're partly because of that, and because we've largely given up coal, we are seeing significant reductions in our emissions. But we also have to ask about the emissions of what we consume. If you import a washing machine from China, at the moment China is blamed for those emissions, but if we're using the washing machine, then really it should be coming onto our tally.
Sure. And with, say, offshore wind and solar prices continuing to tumble year on year, are you optimistic that we'll see at some point a cliff edge where, from a market forces level, the transition to clean energy will become just obvious?
I think we're already seeing that, and we're largely in that place now. If you look at 2016, China actually called off the construction of 92 coal-fired power plants, some of which were virtually ready to switch on. And that was partly because they were concerned about climate change and emissions, but it was also partly because the economics just didn't add up anymore. And in most of the world, renewables is the cheapest now. We've just had open in Britain the first non-subsidised solar farm. We've just seen off the Netherlands and in Germany the first offshore wind that's non-subsidised. So we've basically very nearly got to that point. What we've got to do is see the right sort of policies. So, for example, in Britain, 2016, we were supposed to be going on to the zero carbon home standard, which would have meant that every new home was zero carbon home standard, which would have practically meant that most of them would have had solar panels on the roof. The Tories abolished that at very short notice. Real uncertainty and instability for the building industry. And it means that we're building houses now that immediately need to be retrofitted, both for better insulation and with renewable energy as part of the standard.
Okay, you mentioned China in that answer. How important is global cooperation in reducing climate change? There's obviously things we can do on a national level, but do the Green Party often talk with outside of Europe, so Chinese or Indian? Is there an equivalent of the Green Party?
Well, obviously not in China. There's some brave NGO campaigners in China, but obviously not a Green Party because there's only one party allowed in China. In India there is a Green Party, but I think more broadly what we're looking at, as you rightly identify, is in places that are stepping up the infrastructure. What they're really doing is making the straight leap, as we saw in Africa. Lots of parts of Africa didn't have telephones, and they went straight to mobile phones without any fixed landlines in between. What we're seeing in a lot of the developing world, and India has a big push on to ensure that everyone has access to electricity, which is absolutely right and proper, that increasingly is happening through renewables just because that's the best way to do it.
So, last question I'd say, generally, are you optimistic for our our planet, as a future as a species?
Oh, yes, I am. And one of the things that I think is really clear is that we've been trashing the planet, and that has to stop. But that's actually good news, because we've been trashing the planet and creating a pretty miserable society. I mean, I often use as an example the fact that in Britain, the rate of depression among under 16s has doubled in the past decade. People don't have any security, they're fearful about the future, 0 hours contracts, high rents. We've created a pretty miserable society by trashing the planet. If we actually create a different kind of society with strong local economies built around small businesses and cooperatives. I've just been at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, and there, the huge possibilities of so many jobs, and it's not just the jobs that are doing the farming. If you have a ring of market gardens, small farms around towns and cities, they need accountants, they need marketers, they need renewable energy suppliers. If you build a strong local economy, small businesses all trading with each other, supporting each other, then so many jobs, so many opportunities, rather than what we've got now, which is very much focused on London and the South East, the financial sector, the huge risks of the financial sector, which we haven't dealt with. We haven't created stability or security. We can do that and look after the planet at the same time.
Well, on that very optimistic note, Natalie Bennett, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.